Today, I wanted to talk about a show called Maina and Kingangi. This is a very popular radio show in Kenya, and I wanted to talk about the damage that Maina and Kingangi are doing to our men. And one day, unfortunately, I was stuck in a particular situation where I could not leave, and they were playing this show. And the topic that Maina and Kingangi were talking about was, ladies, why do you still wash your husband's underwear? And I was forced to sit there and listen to a slew of garbage, and it got me thinking about mass media propaganda and what's the point of all of this? Who chooses the topics and why? And even more important, why doesn't the state intervene? So I did an analysis of this show going back 5 to 7 years, and I went examining all the topics that they typically talk about. And I came to the conclusion that this is psychological warfare and propaganda and manipulation of the general public. Maina and Kingangi's show represents vile anti-African and anti-family propaganda. Politically, they are pro-West because they push Western values upon us. So when they were talking about, ladies, why do you still wash your husband's underwear? The general gist of the conversation, which was very vile overall, and this is what is being broadcasted all over the place every single day. The gist and the direction of that conversation was that women should not be homemakers and they should not take care of their family. They were pushing for women to be more rebellious and to reject the family setup as currently constituted. So, and they kept on going and going and going, and they kept on mocking this sort of family setup where the lady takes care of her family and the man takes care financially of the family. They kept on pushing the idea that taking care of your family as a woman is being something like a slave or something like that. And they kept on undermining the idea of family. They kept on undermining the idea of women taking care of their children and their husbands. And when you listen to their show consistently, that is always the gist. It is very inane, it is very profane, it is very negative, and ultimately it's anti-African. You can clearly see that in this show, anything that is considered African values is mocked, and they deride it and they stamp it on the ground, and they give the impression that it is the ultimate foolishness. But anything that is Western is supposed to be good, is supposed to be perfect, it's supposed to be from heaven. Generally, they use very simple analogies, very simple narratives of good and evil, with African culture always being evil and Western culture always being good. I consider them soldiers in the war for the mind, but they are soldiers fighting for the West. They're not our soldiers fighting for us. They're fighting against us. This is typical of coconuts, because like we always say, a coconut is an African person who is brown on the outside and white on the inside. And so these coconuts truly feel that they are Mzungu. Within themselves, they truly believe that they are Mzungu. So Mzungu values become their values, and that's what they're pushing constantly. It's the trauma that has happened to African men, whereby majority of African men have lost their identity. They have lost themselves. They truly believe that they are either a Mzungu or an Arab, and they're willing to kill you for that. So if you attack the Arab, if you attack the Mzungu, the coconuts that believe they're Arab and Mzungu will attack you back. And so they're constantly pushing, in this case of Maina and Kingangi, but it's general propaganda everywhere. So in this battlefield for the mind, you'll discover that these coconuts, whoever they serve, whichever foreign master they serve, they will push for that master, because this is now their new assumed identity. So that in the case of Maina and Kingangi's show, because they identify with the West, they necessarily are against African culture. And so they mock it and they deride it and they attack it 24/7. It's the object of jokes. It's the butt of jokes. They will never say anything pro-African culture. They'll never say, let us honor our ancestors, let us respect ourselves, let us stand for our values. No, they're always battling for Western culture. The mass media in Kenya has generally been weaponized against us for a very long time. Ever since the 1960s, when the traitors were handed over the country at independence, the media was immediately deployed to sustain the neo-colonial situation that we found ourselves inside. And so there's a structure in Kenya, a structure that we are never allowed to talk about and we are never allowed to oppose. And this is the structure of Kenya. It's a pyramidical structure. On top of the pyramid is the Mzungu. And the role of the Mzungu within this structure is that the Mzungu serves as God. So you go to church, there are European idols that Africans are worshipping as their God. And then the other role that the Mzungu plays is owner of assets within the country. The largest companies in Kenya, the largest corporations are all owned by the Mzungu, by the West. Like, for example, if you buy a soft drink, that's Coca-Cola, American. If you buy beer, any kind of beer, that's Diageo, a British company. The largest farms in Kenya are owned by the Mzungu. You go to the Laikipia Plateau, over 1 million acres are owned by 30 Europeans. You go to Rift Valley, vast acreages are owned by the British. You go to Narok, huge, vast ranches are also owned by the Mzungu. You go to Lake Magadi, the entire lake is owned by Indians. So this is the structure that we live in Kenya, with the foreigners being the owners of assets, with the foreigners being God, and with the Africans being at the bottom. Africans are the mkokoteni pushers, the hawkers, the Uber drivers. That's the role that we play at the very bottom. So to sustain this economic structure that is mostly extractive and has resulted in unbelievable poverty in the country, to sustain it, they launched a psychological warfare within the country. So majority of the media houses have traditionally been owned by foreigners. For example, the largest newspaper in Kenya is called the Daily Nation Media Group, and it's owned by foreigners. It's not African owned. With time, new players got into the media market, but majority of the new owners, even if they're African, they're mostly the Africans that we call the coconuts, people who identify very strongly with the West to the point that they themselves believe that they are Mzungu. And for all practical purposes, they are. And so what do they push? They did not stop the tradition of psychological warfare within Kenya to sustain this system that is impoverishing us. So in this battlefield for the mind and this battlefield for the African soul, we find that the media cooperates with Western intelligence agencies to psychologically manipulate African men and the African population in Kenya in order to sustain this lopsided economic structure. When you understand propaganda and psychological warfare, you'll begin to see that the media of Kenya is nothing but a playground for the West in their psychological operations against the male population of Kenya. These psychological operations aim at the insecurities and desires of the targeted population, and to use this as a means to achieve preset objectives. These objectives are war objectives. They seek to break the spirit of the population and to kill the morale of the men. Why would the West do that? Well, if you're a superpower, if you're on top of the food chain, the first thing you do is to prevent others from becoming a superpower or coming into the top of the food chain. You need to understand that the world is competitive, and the big nations are terrified to lose their place of power within the world. Therefore, one of the things you're supposed to do when you have power is to prevent any other person from coming close to you and replacing you in power. So what do? You go around and undermining the spirit of the population. So what you do if you're the West, you're scared of two things. Number one, you're scared of a resurgent Africa. Why? Because you have done so much damage to Africans that at some point the Africans may get it into their mind to retaliate against all the things you've done to them. So the West is always terrified, in particular of Africans, because of the horrific history and the things they subjected us to. And they know at some point, if we were to ever gain power, there are segments of Africans who want to retaliate. So they have to do everything with their power to prevent Africans from gaining global power. So how do you do that? You use very, very many tools. But today, I only want to talk about the psychological warfare tools that they use. So you use these tools to undermine the male population. Don't forget, it is the men of a country who are your enemies, not the women. Women go with whoever wins the war. Okay, women are never loyal to anything except whoever wins. It is the men who are the enemy. In the case of Africa, the West has to undermine the men. How do they do this? It's really, really very easy. First of all, they control the religion. So in the religion that most Africans in Kenya practice, the Mzungu is God. So people go into these temples built by Europeans, in which Europeans have put their own idols, and so Africans go in there and they worship the idols of Europeans. This represents a tremendous psychological defeat for those men already. When your son is seeing you bowing down and worshiping a European statue, what does that do to his mind. He knows that his father is not a warrior. His father is just a slave. He's on his knees, worshipping his very worst enemy as God. That's number one. Number two, the Europeans have taught us, or the West has taught African men not to honor their ancestors. So you will not find any African men in Kenya honoring their ancestors. I'm not exaggerating. The idols that have been built all over are idols of foreigners that Kenyan men worship. For example, you go to University of Nairobi, there's an idol of an Indian called Gandhi. And every year, the university has a ceremony whereby they bow down to the statue of Gandhi and basically worship it. Now, Gandhi said Africans were kafirs, dirty, disgusting, filthy. But the Africans today worship him as some kind of god. Let's keep it moving. The Kenya military, the armed forces of Kenya, have every year a ceremony called Remembrance Day. And in that ceremony, they salute dead European colonialists. They don't salute their own ancestors. You understand what I'm saying? They have no ceremony saluting our dead ancestors who fought for independence. No. The ceremony is about saluting dead Europeans. That is another major psychological defeat, because if you cannot even honor your own ancestors, what kind of man are you? The number three thing that they do, out of very many things, I'm not even trying to claim that I'll cover all the manipulation that is done. No. The third thing they do is that the West totally controls the media. If you switch on TV in Kenya, you will see more Mzungu than you've ever seen in real life. They represent less than 1% of the population, but 99% of the media. Our children are brought up watching European and Western and American cartoons. So we are always made to feel like we are the other on media. The minute you switch on the media, that is not Africa. Now you've moved to the West. So if your small babies are being manipulated that way, there's almost no hope for the new generation, because you're overwhelmed, and they break the spirit of the boys very early on, because you never see yourself on TV. You're never portrayed as good, as a hero. Ask any African child who their hero is. They'll tell you Spider-Man, who's a Mzungu. They cannot tell you a single African character that is a hero. We always say that representation matters, but it doesn't matter in Kenya, because you can almost not find any African media portraying African culture in a positive light in the media. Never. So the other way that they conduct psychological operations against the population of Kenya, and this is not only, of course, unique to Kenya, it's all over Africa. You'll see the same thing any African country you go to. The other way is Sun Tzu, a Chinese general, said that all warfare is based upon deception. You have to give people lies if you're waging war on them. Therefore, in the psychological operations that the West conducts in Africa with the full cooperation of the Kenyan media and Kenyan government is deception. And where is the deception? The deception is everywhere. Almost anything that you're taught in school or you see in the media is false. And when I say false, it's false in a very fundamental way. It is false because of what they choose to show you and what they choose not to show you. For example, they will show you about the war in Ukraine, and they will tell you that you have to support the Ukrainians, you have to support the Mzungu, right? But don't forget that these same Ukrainians, when the war first broke out, they were kicking out Africans from the trains that were leaving the country to go to safety. And they were putting dogs instead of Africans. Africans had to sleep in the train stations. These are the same Mzungu that the media will tell you have to support. You have to support Ukraine. The Mzungu is our best friend. Now, what they won't tell you is the genocide going on in West Papua, conducted on Africans or people who look like Africans by the Indonesian military. They keep that absolute blackout. That's the deception. They show you this story, they refuse to show you that story. The other thing they refuse to talk about is African history, positive African history. For example, in government, in the Ministry of Education, they refuse to teach our students about the Kemetic Empire, which is the most important civilization in the history of the world after the flood. Total blackout. Ask any child in Kenya to name 5 pharaohs. Nothing. They make sure they don't talk about it. Why? Because that's positive information. That can make people have a lot of confidence. And you're not supposed to have confidence. It may make people think that they're equal or superior to Mzungu. You're not supposed to think that. The other deception, obviously, is in geography. And I've talked about this before. The map that the government uses in school is the false map of the earth. The earth doesn't look like the way they show it to you. Africa is much more bigger than Russia, but they show Russia and Europe as being massive, being huge. Let me tell you, England is 1/3 the size of Kenya. 1/3. It's like the size of Rift Valley when it used to be a province. but on the map, they show it massive. Okay, so they use the false map, and they use this to wage psychological warfare on you, for you to think that you're very small, but you're not. Africa is massive. African countries are huge. They are vast. But you'll never suspect that because they give you a deceptive map. The other thing that the media refuses to talk about is who owns the Kenyan economy. Who are the billionaires in Kenya? It's mostly non-Africans, right? For example, if you buy unga ya ugali, who owns the companies? So Indian companies. They don't eat ugali, but they control the trade. So the media will never talk about exactly who owns the Kenyan economy. 70% of the Kenyan economy is owned by non-Africans. African men, like I said before, are mostly slum dwellers and mkokoteni pushers and hawkers. They will never, ever, ever talk about that, because that will induce a rebellion in the country. And you're not supposed to rebel against the system. The pattern of total foreign ownership over everything is never, ever, ever to be questioned. So they never talk about it. So they have to keep you distracted. As a grown man, they have to keep you distracted 24/7, so that you can know that your poverty is your fault. It's not that the system is rigged against you. No, it's your fault, or it's that tribe's fault, or that tribe's fault. They will never point to you at your real enemy, right? And so they have to keep on bringing shows like Maina and Kingangi's inane, trashy shows to keep you distracted and to keep you fighting amongst each other. So what Maina and Kingangi does is to make the women feel dissatisfied being in a family. They are really pushing for family collapse, so that there is constant fighting, and it's really affecting the culture. Slowly by slowly, the corruption, the garbage is seeping through all levels of society. They are systematically collapsing the society from within, so that while you're fighting with your wife, you're not looking at the total ownership of the assets of the country. So the other thing, and I'm just using Maina and Kingangi's show just as an example. It's a particularly egregious example, but the rest of the shows are not better. Okay, it's the same garbage all over the media. But I'm just using this as an example just to show you. So Maina and Kingangi's show pushes the entire culture to conform to Western non-values, and encourages us to forget ourselves and to give up our identity. Many of these shows also, like we said before, mock the nuclear family. Maina and Kingangi mock the nuclear family relentlessly and seek its dissolution. They seek to shape public opinion, shape the psychology of the masses, and mentally control the population without their awareness. The overwhelming war aims of these psychological operations in Kenya through the mass media and the popular media is to control attitudes and beliefs, to marginalize those who oppose the system of white supremacy, and to build consensus around the worship of European images and cultural non-values. This is the essence of propaganda and psychological warfare. And never forget that the government and the media are one and the same thing. They are on the same side, and it is not our side.